city also produced an equity report, which was a compilation of the city's past efforts and the results, and I had some time, so I finally started reading it, hoping to reference it in my own demonstrations. By this time, Eric Tang had produced his report on the city, and the Martin Prosperity Institute report had circulated, and they all detailed how black people were leaving the city because of its racist behavior. When I read the equity report, I realized that there was almost no information about what the city had done, just about what black people had done. From the perspective of that report, the city looked like a non participant in its own racist policies, with mean black people asking for too much from the city's resources. I began doing research on what the city had done, and at first, I was completely overwhelmed by the lack of information. Most of the responses seemed dedicated to the 1928 Master Plan, which was convenient as everyone who had initiated and implemented that policy was dead. I went to the LBJ School of Public Affairs library and found the names of some groups, and they recommended the Austin History Center. While at the Austin History Center, one of the staff introduced me to the city minutes, which were online, and I did a search on one of the groups I found at LBJ, and I pulled up a lot of dates where the group appeared in the meetings. Clicking on one of the results, I noticed the actions of the group and the response from the city, and when I had gone through all the results, I realized that there was a message from this information. I contacted my colleague and stated that this was more than a small piece, but the beginning of a book project, and this was how I started my first major independent project, which was completed largely alone. As for the app and the staff, I offered a recommendation for the programmer so that he was able to secure lasting employment. My colleague had already found a different job in Fort Worth, and I was struggling to make my latest retirement liquidation last as long as possible. By the time I was gaining personal income, I had invested in multiple visits to Fort Worth to maintain the collaboration with my colleague, 2 conferences, 1 international, to possibly gain traction for research funding as an independent entity. Most of my debt was in favor of maintaining deciphercity.org because there was still a rise in racial justice missions, and at that point, I was simply trying to break even. My colleague and I produced a number of shorter projects on the blog and even included a podcast at her suggestion, but despite hours of time on social media, there was no traction. In 2018, I put together a piece called Not in the Plan, demonstrating that the problem with the regular community engagement was that activists would go to meetings, ask for things, but get ignored. I paid for a great deal of feedback on that piece, and it never translated to income. While many people may consider that it was foolish to keep trying to make a business work, bear in mind that most new businesses fail, and it was relatively inexpensive to keep applying for grants and contracts while working full-time and maintaining a presence on social media. In fact, I had taken a job designed to help me get out of debt just in case the business never amounted to anything. Sadly, by that time, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility had been published, and why hire a black woman to do research when a white woman could be called in and soothe all the elitists and bullies by telling them they're fragile? There was a supposedly socialist group called the Democratic Socialists of America that allegedly worked to elect a black man who was formerly incarcerated onto the city council in the fall of 2018. Not only did I think very highly of the candidate, who I had met while he was doing his work with grassroots initiatives, but I was very much in favor of white people using their privilege to promote someone whose society deemed unworthy. His wife also advocated for mental health, and as someone who's been institutionalized due to depression at the Yale Psychiatric Institute, I thought they were the perfect power couple to advocate for the unheard on the days of the city council. However, as is often the case in white spaces, the candidate demonstrated non-compliance with the dominant narrative, and he was called to task. People said the most horrible things to him, and he was forced to take it because he needed them to do work advocating for his candidacy. None of the white people in the organization took responsibility for the fact that black people are always held to a higher behavioral standard than white people, and many of them believed he was getting his just desserts. He did not manage to secure the seat on the days because that is the truth of Austin, Texas. All the progressivism is a lie, all of it. I stayed with the Democratic Socialists of America for a while longer only because there was a hodgepodge of people and I was stupid enough to be flattered by false confidence. Compliments. This is a very common tactic with a lot of organizations, and it works because black people are used to constant emotional abuse or negligence. I thought that if I were able to develop rapport, I might be able to find contracts for research or contacts for a better job, since most of the organization was involved with privileged people. Yes, I consider myself to be a socio-anarchist, but I also know that people like to keep themselves comfortable, and not many people are looking to change. I volunteered to be on the housing committee because of my planning background, and I thought I was working with someone who wanted to work with me and be transparent as a co-committee leader. Because a future roommate knew about my research with deciphercity.org, she invited me to speak with the League of Women Voters. What I did not know at the time was that the League of Women Voters was inconsistent about its stance on racial segregation, but because the United States lies about its history, I assumed that the organization was about engaging women at the ballot. I wanted to see what the organization was about, so I agreed to go to one meeting first, and I met the executive director of Foundation Communities, an organization founded on alleviating homelessness. Foundation Communities was opening a number of properties all over the city, and I thought that not only would he be a good contact for the Democratic Socialists of America, but as a potential research contract for deciphercity.org. After attending that meeting, I began to feel very positive about my engagement with all of these entities and even more professional, having basically been left to manage deciphercity.org alone with my meager resources. Well, I presented at the League of Women Voters, and I had a decent time because I am generally not a shy person, and my Decipher City colleague was still willing to do something to help, putting together most of the PowerPoint presentation for the organization. Towards the end, there was some justification for the racism of Austin, which I attributed to the denialism that most of the city possess, so I ignored it. I was sharing the space with another black woman who was discussing black maternal mortality in hospitals, so I wanted to make sure she had adequate time, and I was interested in what she had to say. At the end of my presentation, there was a huge red flag because they asked for me to come speak at the meeting alone to have me all to themselves. I ignored it because, again, I could never be sure who was there, and I was still hoping to launch deciphercity.org for either research or tech, certain I could find the resources to do so. I had to help plan a forum with the Democratic Socialists of America, and we were discussing the logistics of where the event should be held. My co-committee leader spent a lot of time bad-mouthing the executive director of Foundation Communities, which made me look bad for two reasons. First, I was trying to get to know the structural world of socialists, and she was doing nothing except let me flounder, not sharing any information about it until I looked ignorant. Second, she was a white activist who thought that talking smack about people while doing very little outside her comfort zone was the same thing as structural change, and people like that will never do anything that will affect them in the long run. Later, she would help with the Bernie Sanders campaign, who I despise, but for different reasons than vote diversion. People who build themselves at the expense of black people are eventually loathsome, as my co-committee leader was turning out to be. I confronted her on her not sharing information with me, and she was silent, because she truly had no response for alienating someone she supposedly considered her equal. The forum occurred, it was engaging, but when the executive director tried to hug me, I shied away and shook his hand, opting to maintain some professionalism. I had become less comfortable with the dominant population's need to assume familiarity with me while offering me nothing, and I was slowly becoming more aware of extractive tendencies of many entities, including the Democratic Socialists of America. After that, my co-committee leader was going to be out of town, and I was responsible for choosing a site for the meeting. I had decided to go to an environmental committee meeting, and there was a conversation about engaging with the non English speaking communities. Knowing that a lot of those communities worked in fast food, I suggested meeting at McDonald's, and a white woman smirked and said, "Yes, but that's a problem with me because I'm vegan." She rolled her eyes at me, and the meeting continued, which made me determined to schedule a meeting at McDonald's since I supposedly had that power. I was then informed by my co committee leader that she had already chosen the spot for the meeting, but had neglected to inform me. After not being informed about so much, having my autonomy taken away, and the blatant anti blackness of the organization, I decided that enough was enough and announced that I would be leaving the organization. There was no point in staying with a group that got off on bragging that they had black membership, but did everything in their power to command my compliance with their culture, adding nothing but of myself but my emotional and occasional physical labor. My co-committee leader faked empathy and asked for a conversation, but when I confronted her about her behavior, she gaslighted me by saying that I was not really angry with her, but at the other white woman who had disrespected me at the other meeting. I knew that there was no going forward with the organization, and I held the meeting I agreed to hold at her preferred location, a coffee shop, and left. Someone tried to flatter me into doing more work later, but I directed that individual to the places where he could do his own work and leave me out of it. For one presentation, I was invited to a private school by a teacher to do a presentation on the hate you give, and I was offered no money for the task. Not only did I have to rent a car to get to the site, but despite mentioning the PowerPoint and a lesson I had prepared, there was no setup for my presentation once I arrived. At the school, there was a black teacher who thanked me for my efforts because she knew that no one had offered to make my job any easier, and I was left fending for myself. The only thing that went right about that presentation were the questions I asked, and even though the students asked me to come back, all I could see was the cost of renting a car and no preparation for receiving my efforts. After that presentation, I finally stopped paying for the server for the Decipher City app, and I accepted that it would be impossible to get paid for engagement, regardless of all the meetings and investment I had made. I continued doing the writing and research, but other than a grand total of $340 from 2017 until 2022, there were no donations coming from the blog. People seem to be under the impression that black people enjoy pulling all of our resources into events and opportunities which never have any returns. No, people should avoid anyone who makes a point of getting rich on the backs of other advocates, and the corruption in the activism world is not sacred. However, when nothing is offered to those who are expending time, energy, and resources, that becomes an issue of both entitlement and racism. Black people have had to make up the difference in our compensation for centuries, and it is immature to believe that money just comes from the sky to make our lives what they are. The individuals who claim to be so excited about the possibility of my doing well with Decipher City were the same people who were nowhere to be found when I was forced to change directions. For one thing, everyone seemed to be looking for someone else to fund me rather than leading by example. For another, they seemed to think that my frustration at racism was entertainment rather than a painstaking effort that took hours away from my life. By the middle of 2019, my full-time job had begun to dissolve. I was forced to move to avoid further financial abuse, and I was once again looking for ways to recover the gaps in income. During this entire time, my colleague had not only stayed employed but gained better employment, doing less and less of the blog while pretending to support me. The League of Women Voters contacted me to speak at their meeting, but when I asked for $50 of the speaking fee based on the 2 hours for the meeting, I was rejected, and other than some banana bread from a member, I never heard from them again. To be honest, this was one of the reasons that I had no interest in joining organizations that already existed, especially as long established as that. Later that year, the same organization would host a forum, and demand to be reimbursed by the city for their independent efforts. Because the League of Women Voters originally refused to hold the line on segregation, that behavior was consistent with my experience. Remember, segregation was not only racial segregation, but allowing black people and others to do all the work fixing up a location and then coming up with an excuse to manipulate us out of long-term communities. In the fall of 2019, DecipherCity.org collaborated with Chisalo's Cycling Initiative and the Carver Museum to organize a Black History bike tour for publicity of all three places and to possibly gain financial traction doing history tours by bicycle. Despite the tours and a conference in New York City, I was steadily losing my financial stability while others were maintaining theirs, sacrificing very little. This is usually the way that the lives of black people work when participating in activism within the dominant narrative. We are struggling to find our ways while other people gain attention from our efforts. We can put our all into it and stay working as hard as we can, but we are also struggling while trying to attend meetings, while trying to mobilize others, dealing with debt and instability while others stay comfortable. Unless we already have healthy savings, an impossibility for most people under the age of 40, despite whatever lies older people have for us, there is no way that we can avoid substantial loss if we put our efforts into racial justice efforts. DecipherCity.org attended one more conference in New York in which I organized the entire presentation, and there's where I met a dean from college who immediately recognized me. Also, there was a play in town with Zawe Ashton and Tom Hiddleston, which allowed me to support a black actress and see Loki in person. My colleague did not participate in creating the PowerPoint, was mainly disengaged the entire time, and tried to ruin the play just because I had paid for that, but I was catching on to her contempt for me and black people in general by that point. Even when black people are told that our collaborators truly see us as equal, if we wait long enough or are ever in close quarters, we will immediately be disabused of such a notion. By the beginning of 2020, Tatiana Jefferson had been murdered, and my Decipher City colleague, instead of showing up for our year-long strategy meeting, ran off to pretend to be a black ally, delaying my schedule to demand control. She offered a fake apology like she always did, but since it had become a pattern, I knew that her apology meant nothing. This was further compounded by her blowing up my phone during a meeting where she was supposedly being compassionate. Most fake allies know that being seen as an ally is more important to the dominant narrative than doing anything that would diminish the dominant narrative. Instead of being surprised with this behavior or impressed with her attention, I knew then that my days of having even the idea of a colleague were over, and it was time to start setting some distance. As I waited based on my commitment, a pattern was emerging of my colleague exploiting me for her own benefit, repeated excuses, and blanket manipulation. She would be comfortable regardless of what happened with racism because she made sure to be comfortable even if she had to emotionally abuse what she clearly considered her pet monkey based on her behavior. I called her on her behavior, and then she predictably threw a tantrum, whining about how she never meant to be involved, she needed to set some boundaries, and she would only be doing exactly the little she felt entitled to do. That same week, she attempted to coerce and manipulate me into participating in a conference when I had specifically told her that I was no longer willing to spend time or money on events that never brought in money. While being a name brand Negro and using the master's tools, there is no protection. And the reality is that the dominant narrative will abandon any black individual who makes them look bad. Begging her to do her part and taking on all the additional labor and responsibilities, well, that was supposedly my lot as a black woman from the United States. Holding her accountable for disrespecting my time, money, and energy, not only did I have to be scolded, but after the second in-person tour with Chisalo's Cycling Initiative, I found that our website was further sabotaged by her tantrum, the links to the story map deleted. Thank goodness I had a relationship with Chisalo's Cycling Initiative, as the organization quickly migrated links to its story map, and thank goodness her irresponsibility led her to use my phone to record the videos. I repaired the website and, despite my better judgment, did not immediately delete her from access. The rest of the year involved two posts while filling up deciphercity.org's Gmail drive with her separate projects, bullying me with one of her coworkers, and stalking my social media efforts while sneering with others who enjoyed bullying me. Because every black woman is entitled to abuse under the dominant narrative, the only accountability I had was not to contact her anymore, which I stopped doing after she attempted to steal credit for my Juneteenth publication in June 2021. A friend of mine sent me information in 2020 about a fellowship with the Urban Land Institute, which had a reasonable salary. I was truly excited, especially since I had a website that was designed to showcase my talent and could move me forward in a career based on urban planning, even though I had a racial justice bent. My face fell when I saw that the premise of the fellowship was about the privatization of public space, because privatization of public space was, is, and always has been about segregation in the United States. Angry, I applied to the position, demanding that they acknowledge that they were essentially saying that only people with money deserved to be in public, while people without money deserved to be confined to their homes and their jobs. I sent a research proposal and a timeline, and I never heard back. However, they did choose a Latina planner to promote segregation. This is a predictable pattern of the dominant narrative. Get a vulnerable BIPOC individual, married, parent, or broke, to defend itself and shake its head at anyone pointing out its obvious cruelty. Thus, in 2020, reputable institutions were legitimizing segregation tactics. Some people may blame me for being forthright, but the problem in the United States is that there are two huge groups of people who are too complacent for their own good. And being around people who only promote the status quo is why the United States is where it is. People who cannot participate in the status quo are encouraged to internalize themselves as failures, and it made me sad that yet another organization I had formerly respected was promoting segregation. Ironically, the more I failed as an urban planner, the more I was able to see how unrepentantly destructive the whole profession is. All of this happened before the murder of George Floyd, which would purportedly push racial justice to the forefront of the national consciousness. In the middle of 2020, my full-time job had collapsed and my rent was being raised. I had seen it coming, but all the jobs I had applied to failed to materialize, and then I was in the middle of the lockdown. For those saying I would have been able to make more money if there had never been any lockdowns, bear in mind that I had been applying to jobs for months, except for the IRS. I had no vehicle, I did not live alone, and the thought of being admitted to the hospital for a disease that had no immunity or cure at the time was terrifying to both me and my roommate. I taught online and I completed independent projects for Gisalo's cycling initiative, but because my full-time job was a small private business, I was ineligible for unemployment. A friend shared a public school food that her kids refused to eat, and that was how I was able to eat during the summer of 2020. At the end of May was the nightmare that was George Floyd. My roommate saw the entirety of the execution, but I was still just disgusted that it had occurred. We made a video together during which I recited poetry, not by memory, but close enough to be a decent film. Through all of the awareness campaigns, there was a black man who managed to make an impromptu bicycle tour of East Austin, and the local paper claimed that it was the first ever bicycle tour of East Austin. This was offensive not only because I had just finished participating in 4 bicycle tours, but I had gotten the idea from Six Square, a different organization that organized my first tour experience in 2015, led by black women. I called the guy on it, as well as the newspaper, even a conference where this black man was scheduled as a guest, and everyone made milksop responses about how they were unaware. Sadly, this never amounted in the black man making a public acknowledgement, nor did the newspaper publicly retract its statement. The information was surreptitiously changed by the newspaper, but by then, the black men went on to receive publicity while the black women were deliberately ignored. One of the reasons there has never been a universal women's movement in the United States is because everyone has been conditioned to believe that black women are the footstools of everyone, including black men. It could be argued that we are degraded because of the patriarchy, but there are so many other women of other cultures and ethnicities that enjoy extracting labor from us. In this case, a woman of color wrote the story praising a black man despite being corrected about him being a first. No one can justify elevating a black man at the expense of black women, but because that tour happened during a time when anti-racism was trending, he enjoyed the attention while the black women got nothing. In the past, I often stated that information should be free, but the reality is that cultivation of information is not free. For people to jump on board with a black man and then avert their gaze when being held accountable for ignoring black women is yet another reason why black women are disengaging with activism within the dominant narrative.